Welcome to Context. I'm Brad Harris. Today, I want to talk about boredom, not to escape it, but to rescue it. Before we begin, if you're enjoying the show and you want to help me keep going, there are two main ways you can do that. First, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/Brad Cole Harris. There, you'll get access to bonus episodes only available to supporters. In fact, the next episode I release will only be for supporters. The second way you can help is to share this podcast with someone you think would appreciate it. In an age of algorithms, word of mouth is still the best way to grow. I like that. There's definitely something reassuring about that. Thank you. Now let's get back to boredom. We live in a culture that treats boredom like a design flaw, something to be eliminated by better entertainment, faster connectivity, infinite scrolling. But that view has been challenged for a long time. From philosophers to poets to psychologists, many individuals through the ages have pointed out that boredom may actually be essential, not just to individual creativity, but to civilization. I've always been intrigued by that idea and suspected that the disappearance of boredom from modern life might help explain some of our most dangerous cultural dysfunctions today. The collapse of attention, the rise of ideological extremism, the erosion of inner life that's critical to keeping our world good and beautiful. In this episode, we're going to explore the idea that boredom is not a bug, but a feature of the human condition, that it is a kind of sacred silence between the notes, that without it, culture becomes noise, and that the death of boredom might be one of the great spiritual crises of the digital age. We begin with a simple observation. For most of human history, boredom was common. It wove seamlessly through the fabric of daily life. In the 20th century, writers like Virginia Woolf and poets like T.S. Eliot saw boredom not as something to escape from, but something to write from. In the 19th century, you might wait an hour at the dusty crossroads for the weekly stagecoach to deliver the mail. In the 18th century, farmers paused beneath porch covers to watch clouds roll by, simply waiting out the rain before they could resume plowing their fields. In the candlelit evenings of the 17th century, after chores were finished but before sleep arrived, families often sat quietly by the fire, minds wandering, staring into flames that danced without end. Further back, medieval shepherds spent countless hours watching their flocks graze, with nothing to occupy them but the slow movement of grass in the breeze. Medieval monasteries enforced long hours of silence, not to punish, but to prepare the mind for prayer. Ancient Roman merchants stood idle in sunlit marketplaces, endlessly awaiting customers, their gaze drifting across busy crowds. The Greeks spoke of skole, the origin of our word school. It meant leisure, but not in the sense of passive relaxation. It was time set aside for contemplation, conversation, and philosophy. The highest form of human life, they believed, required slowness, stillness, boredom. And long before recorded history, it's easy to imagine our prehistoric ancestors might wait in the quiet hours of dawn each morning before their prey came within bowshot, or they might sit silently at the river's edge as the sun slid through the afternoon sky, just waiting for fish to appear. Pre-industrial life, especially prehistoric life, was hard. People were busy just trying to survive. And yet, there were these everyday intermissions, quiet, unavoidable, unremarkable, and they were as ubiquitous as breathing. Minds wandered, egos softened, and individuals lost themselves over and over again in the gentle drift of unstructured thought. All this time, all the way up until barely 20 years ago, boredom was still a near constant companion. I'm in my 40s now. When I was in my 20s, I remember having nothing to distract me while I waited in lines, or sat on the front porch, or walked down the road. The escape hatch of the smartphone was still not yet within reach. And now, it's never out of reach. Now, the average person touches his smartphone some 3,000 times a day by official estimates. We don't wait anymore. We don't wander. We scroll. Which means boredom has become rare. And so has something else: sustained attention, deep thought. Because what we call boredom is not merely the absence of stimulation, it is the space in which we become reacquainted with ourselves, where ideas emerge, where intuition speaks, where patterns form. Boredom is the crucible of the imagination. You see this clearly in the lives of great thinkers. In one of his letters, Charles Darwin lamented his absence of interest in listening to more music or reading another poem to pass the hours, reconciling himself instead to simple observation to pass the time. Quote, "My mind seems to have become a kind of machine for grinding general laws out of large collections of facts." End quote. But where did that grinding happen? His writing makes clear: in boredom, on long walks, in silently watching various organisms around him. Indeed, Darwin famously spent 8 painstaking years from 1846 to 1854 meticulously studying barnacles. His intensive work on these seemingly unremarkable creatures involved hundreds of hours examining their intricate anatomy under a microscope, carefully documenting variations, patiently sorting endless specimens into meticulous categories. This laborious and often tedious study not only earned him recognition as a world-leading expert on barnacles, but also helped clarify his thinking on evolution by natural selection. It was precisely within those countless quiet hours of observation, of sustained, repetitive boredom, that Darwin's revolutionary insights took shape. Boredom can certainly be uncomfortable, but discomfort is not always bad. Hunger compels us to eat. Fatigue compels us to rest. Boredom compels us to think, or at least it used to. We've constructed a world now in which we never need to be bored. But the unintended consequence is that we never need to confront the contents of our own minds. That's not liberation. That's avoidance. And when society avoids inner life long enough, its outer life becomes manic. We begin to demand constant novelty. We mistake noise for meaning. We become allergic to silence. And that's a shame for many reasons. One is that silence can be profoundly charismatic. Think about the most magnetic people you've known. They rarely fear pauses in conversation. They're comfortable lingering quietly, either alone or together. They're at ease with their own thoughts, and they trust that silence does not equate to social failure. Far from awkwardness, their silent confidence draws us in. It's precisely their ability to share silence comfortably, to be fully present without noise, that makes them so appealing. In losing our boredom, we've also lost touch with the charisma of silence, with the gentle allure of simply coexisting without the need for constant chatter. I go down these nerd rabbit holes from time to time. I hope I'm not alone. You might do this too. Maybe because we're trying to avoid being bored. I don't know. But If you watch YouTube videos of interviews with politicians or cultural icons or students from a generation or two ago, you'll likely notice two striking differences. First is how much more curious, patient, and articulate those people generally appear to be. Second is how much interviewees pause before answering questions. The pace of past discourse overall, from talk shows to news segments, was just so much more thoughtful and deliberate. They had the luxury of taking their time because they weren't competing with an ongoing avalanche of distraction. In his book, The World Beyond Your Head, philosopher and author Matthew Crawford observes that our culture now treats attention as a commodity to be harvested rather than a skill to be cultivated. He writes, quote, "The rise of the attention economy has made it possible for others to profit from our distraction." End quote. Our restlessness has become their business model. Likewise, Tristan Harris, the former Google ethicist turned tech reformer, argues that we now live in what he calls a perpetual novelty machine. He says, quote, "There's always something new, always something more engaging, always something designed to hijack your attention." End quote. And once hijacked, it rarely returns intact. The implications are enormous, not just for individual well-being, but for our collective sanity. Without boredom, democracy suffers. Good citizenship requires reflection. It requires the ability to entertain multiple perspectives, to tolerate ambiguity, to wrestle with nuance, none of which are possible in a state of perpetual stimulation. Without boredom, childhood suffers. Play, imagination, and self-authorship all emerge in boredom. If every moment of a child's life is programmed, gamified, or otherwise algorithmically optimized, when do kids really get to organically create anything for themselves? While we're on the subject of kids, rising youth anxiety, depression, attention deficit, addiction to distraction, these are not separate problems. They are symptoms of a deeper malady, the loss of the ability to be alone with one's thoughts. Tragically, the more we lose boredom, the lonelier we become. Loneliness, especially among young people, is becoming an epidemic. According to a recent study from the U.S. Surgeon General's office, loneliness has reached crisis levels with effects on mortality comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That's shocking. But the numbers get worse. The CDC recently found that almost 60% of teenage girls in America now report persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, an all-time high, closely correlated with rising smartphone use and social media engagement. The social psychologist Jonathan Haidt's groundbreaking research shows an unmistakable spike in anxiety and depression beginning around 2012, precisely when smartphone ownership among teenagers surpassed 50%. Another psychologist, Jean Twenge, corroborates these findings, highlighting that teens who spend more than 5 hours a day on social media are twice as likely to develop depression as those who spend less than an hour. Today's digital world simulates social life, much like being at a crowded party where you don't know anyone. You're surrounded by people, flooded with the spectacle of the party, but you end up feeling more isolated than ever for being there. The truth is, in generations past, most individuals were actually more isolated in raw logistical terms. But the absence of constant social stimulation felt normal. It didn't feel like exclusion. It wasn't something to be afraid of, and it certainly wasn't interpreted as some personal failure. Today, however, so many of us, especially young people, have developed a hyperactive fear of missing out, not on something in particular, but on everything, all the time. The digital world floods us with things we aren't attending, events we didn't get invited to, adventures we aren't having, lives we aren't living. This isn't merely a psychological quirk, it's a pervasive shift in how we experience our own lives. In the past, being alone never felt so oppressive because it was assumed to be a shared experience. Now, being alone can feel like a personal indictment of social failure. Back when solitude wasn't synonymous with loneliness, the boredom that often grew out of it tended to draw people together in a real way. Boredom compelled people to venture into shared spaces, toward communal fires and town squares, onto porches and into libraries, to sit next to strangers in churches and bars, to strike up a conversation with the elderly neighbor. Boredom wasn't a vacuum, it was a doorway. The ultimate irony is that boredom, by inviting us inward, often leads us outward, sometimes toward our fellow human beings, but also toward wonder, like Charles Darwin, or toward service, or toward imagination. Cognitive scientists have shown that boredom increases creativity and that people deprived of stimulation are more likely to generate original ideas. They've documented how mind wandering is correlated with problem solving and that daydreaming predicts empathy. In other words, boredom makes us more human. So, maybe you were avoiding being bored when you pressed play on this episode. And maybe it's okay not to know exactly what you'll do with your mind when this episode ends. Maybe it even helps to imagine that countless other people around the world will also be lingering in the quiet space between what they just finished and whatever comes next. And maybe there's some solidarity to be rediscovered there, even if most of us haven't felt anything like that for a long time. And if that feeling leads you to do nothing in particular for a bit, well, maybe that's the point. I'm Brad Harris. So long.